Clara Voss burned the last letter standing on the platform at Driftwood Creek, her fingers steady, even as the paper curled black and fell to the dust at her feet. No tears, no screaming, just fire, and then ash, and then nothing. The man who'd written those words, who'd promised partnership, honesty, a life worth building, had not come. She had $4, a carpetbag, and the kind of quiet fury that either destroys a woman completely or turns her into something unbreakable. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The station master at Driftwood Creek had seen plenty of women arrive on the afternoon train looking hopeful. He had never seen one arrive looking like she'd already decided to go to war. Clara Voss stepped off the platform with her carpetbag in her left hand and a small bundle of letters in her right. And she stood there in the September heat of Wyoming territory without moving, without speaking, without doing anything at all, except scanning every face in the thin crowd with eyes the color of creek water in winter, green, cold, and reading everything. Nobody stepped forward. She waited 4 minutes. She counted them by the pulse in her own throat. Then she walked to the station master's window, set the carpetbag down, and said, "I'm looking for Seth Calloway. I was told he'd be here." The station master, a man named Peck, with tobacco stains on his collar and a habit of sizing women up before he spoke to them, took his time looking her over. "Calloway, huh?" "That's what I said." "You the mail order woman?" Clara's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. "I'm Clara Voss of St. Louis. I correspond with Mr. Calloway. He expected me today. Does he know I'm here or not?" Peck scratched the back of his neck. "Well, miss, I reckon he knows. His foreman was in this morning asking about the schedule." He paused. "Calloway himself wasn't with him." "I see." Clara picked up her bag. "How far is the ranch?" 12 miles west. But you ain't thinking of walking it." "I'm thinking of a great many things right now. Walking is one of them." "There's a boarding house, Mrs. Whitmore on 2nd Street. She takes women alone. Clean place, $2 a night." Clara opened her reticule and looked at what was inside for one honest moment, then closed it. "And the other 12 miles? Is there a road or just open country?" Peck stared at her. "Miss Voss, you got nowhere to sleep, by the looks of it, and the sun sets in 3 hours. The canyon trail west of town is no place for a woman on foot after dark. It ain't safe." "Mr. Peck," Clara said, "I have been not safe before. Thank you for your concern." She turned and walked toward the main street of Driftwood Creek without looking back, and Peck watched her go with the expression of a man who has just realized he is watching something happen that he will be telling people about for years. The town was the kind of place that looked better from a distance. Up close, it was rough lumber and warped boards, a saloon that smelled of last week's arguments, a general store with a faded awning, a church that looked newer than everything else and sat at the far end of the street like an afterthought. Women on porches watched Clara pass. Men outside the blacksmith shop watched her too. Nobody offered to help. Nobody said a word. That was fine. Clara was not there for words. She was there because 3 months ago she'd read an advertisement in the St. Louis Courier. An honest, unflowered announcement from a rancher in Wyoming territory, seeking a capable woman for a practical partnership and eventually, if both parties agreed, marriage. No promises of love, no painting of golden sunsets. Just a plain description of hard work, fair dealing, and a man who said outright, "I will not waste your time with pretty lies." She'd answered because she recognized honesty when she read it, or thought she did. She'd written 4 letters before Seth Calloway wrote back. When he did, the response was 3 pages long, careful and direct, and it said things that no one had ever said to Clara Voss in her 26 years of living. That her skills were not invisible to him. That a woman who could run an institution, manage accounts, and care for the sick was not ordinary. That what she described as her limitations were in his reading something closer to qualifications. She'd read that letter 11 times. She knew because she'd counted. And now she was here, and he was not. And the afternoon sun was cutting through her traveling dress like an insult. Clara stopped at the edge of town where the road turned to dirt and the buildings gave way to open space. She set her bag down, pulled the bundle of letters from her coat pocket, and looked at them for a long moment. Seth Calloway's handwriting was even and economical. No flourishes, no wasted loops. The handwriting of a man who had things to do and didn't like doing them twice. She untied the ribbon. She read the last line of the last letter he'd sent. "I will be there when the train arrives. You have my word on it." Clara struck a match from the box in her pocket, held the flame to the corner of the page, and watched it catch. She held the letters until the fire reached her fingers, then dropped them and stepped on the ash. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger, out of something colder and more practical. She was done carrying promises that had already been broken. She needed both hands free. She picked up her bag and started walking west. The canyon trail opened up about a quarter-mile past the last building, a cut through red rock walls that narrowed in some places to barely the width of a wagon. Clara had been told it was the shorter route. She had not been told that shorter meant switchbacks over loose shale and a path that seemed to go sideways as often as it went forward. She walked with her eyes down, watching her footing, her free hand trailing along the canyon wall for balance. The stone was warm. Everything here was warm. A different kind of warm than Missouri, dry and serious, like the land wasn't trying to comfort you so much as inform you. She was 40 minutes in when she heard the horse. Not moving. Not the sound of hoofbeats, but the particular unhappy sound of a horse that was standing in one place and not understanding why. A low, restless shuffle, and then a sharp exhale. Clara stopped walking. She shifted her bag to her other hand and listened. The sound came from around the next bend, maybe 30 yards. She moved toward it, keeping close to the wall. What she found was a gray roan gelding standing in a widened section of the canyon, reins trailing on the ground, sides heaving, a deep cut along one shoulder that had bled down the horse's leg and dried dark against the pale rock. The horse turned its head and looked at Clara with one white-ringed eye and didn't bolt, which told her it was either well-trained or exhausted. Probably both. There was no rider. Clara scanned the area. The trail continued west around another bend. The canyon walls were high on both sides, and in one place along the left wall, there was fresh debris, a scatter of broken rock and red earth that hadn't been there long. She could tell because the color was wrong. Too bright, too raw. The underside of stone that had been inside the wall until very recently. She tied the horse's reins to a fixed jut of rock. The animal led her. She walked to the debris field. He was there. Half buried under a fall of rock and earth, one arm pinned, his body twisted in a way that was immediately, viscerally wrong. A man, dark coat, broad shoulders, face turned to the ground, not moving. Clara dropped her bag and ran. She reached him and went to her knees in the gravel and put 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse, faint and fast and present. She exhaled through her teeth. "Can you hear me?" Her voice was sharp, not gentle. She needed information, not to comfort. "Sir, can you hear me?" A sound came from him, low and ragged, more air than voice. "I need you to tell me where the pain is worst. Can you do that?" Another sound. His head moved, maybe an inch. "All right." Clara sat back and assessed the situation with the same clear-eyed speed she'd used at the orphanage when something went wrong, and there was no one else to handle it. The rock pinning his arm was large but not massive, maybe 200 pounds. The debris around it could be cleared. His face was cut. His breathing was too fast and too shallow, which meant either broken ribs or something worse. She couldn't know which until she could move him, and she couldn't move him until the arm was free. She stood and searched the canyon floor until she found what she needed. A length of dead juniper about 5 feet long, thick as her wrist. She picked up a flat rock about the size of a dinner plate, carried it back, positioned it close to the pinned arm as a fulcrum, and set the juniper against the boulder at an angle. "When I lift," Clara said, putting herself into position, "you pull your arm free. You need to pull. I cannot hold it long. Do you understand me?" The man's head moved again. A word came out, broken and hoarse. "Yeah." "On 3. 1, 2, 3. She threw her whole weight onto the lever. The boulder shifted, grinding against the ground, and she heard the man make a sound that was nothing like language and everything like pain. And she shouted, "Now! Pull! Now!" And she felt the lever buckling under her and held it anyway, shaking, her boots sliding on loose rock until she heard the scrape of movement and felt the boulder settle back, and she dropped the lever and fell forward onto her hands. He'd moved. He was free. Clara pushed herself upright and went back to him, pulling her coat off as she moved, tearing the hem of her petticoat into strips, with the same focus she'd torn accounts into salvageable pieces at the orphanage when the numbers didn't balance and no one else knew how to fix it. She turned him over, carefully, supporting the freed arm, and got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 34, 35. Dark hair, dirty now with rock dust and sweat. A strong face, the kind that had learned not to show what it was feeling, and had been practicing long enough that it looked almost natural. There was a scar on his jaw, an old one, white against the tanned skin. His eyes were closed. One shoulder was torn open, bleeding steadily. She packed the wound and bound it tight. His breathing evened out slightly, which was something. "Stay with me," Clara said, not gently but firmly, the way she'd said it to frightened children and feverish infants and old men who'd stopped fighting. "You are going to stay with me." His eyes opened. They were brown, dark brown, and even half-conscious and glassed over with shock. They were the eyes of a man who was accustomed to being in charge of situations. He looked at her, and something moved across his face that she could not read. "Who?" he started. "Clara Voss. I found your horse first, then you. What's your name?" A pause. Then, "James." He said it a beat too slow, like he was picking it from a shelf. "James Cole." "All right, James. You've got at least one broken rib, possibly more, and that shoulder needs proper attention. There's a cave about 50 yards back. I saw the opening when I came in. I'm going to get you there before dark. I can walk." "You cannot walk. Don't argue with me about this." He tried to prove her wrong. She gave him credit for the attempt. He made it approximately 2 feet before the leg she hadn't yet assessed gave out completely, and she caught him by the arm and took most of his weight and said, "Broken. Your left leg is broken. I need you to work with me now and argue with me later." "Bossy," he said, through his teeth, which were clenched against the pain. "Competent," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." It took nearly 20 minutes to get him to the cave, which was shallow but deep enough, with the remains of an old fire ring from some previous traveler's overnight stop. Clara got him settled against the wall, checked his wounds again, and went back for her carpet bag, and then for his horse, which she tied at the cave's entrance, where it could be seen from the trail. If anyone came looking, the horse would tell them where to look. She built a fire from the juniper scraps she found along the canyon wall, working fast before the light failed completely. When she turned back to her patient, he was watching her. "You came from the train," he said. His voice was stronger now. The pain was still there, but he was working around it, which meant his mind was clearer than his body. "Afternoon train from the east." Clara looked at him. "I did." "You're alone." "I am now." "What happened to whoever was supposed to meet you?" She fed another piece of wood to the fire and didn't answer immediately. When she did, she kept her voice flat and informational. "He didn't come." "That why you were walking the canyon trail at dusk by yourself? 12 miles to nowhere in particular?" "I had a destination. The timing was inconvenient." She opened her carpet bag and took out her mother's medical journal, the packet of dried herbs she carried out of a habit she'd never been able to explain, even to herself. Yarrow, willow bark, comfrey, things her hands had packed while her mind was making lists of other things. "Does anything hurt besides what I've already addressed?" "My pride." "That'll heal on its own. Tell me about the ribs." He told her. 2 broken on the left side, he thought, from where the rock had caught him when the canyon wall gave way. He described it with the careful precision of a man accustomed to assessing damage, not dwelling on it, not dramatizing it, just cataloging what was wrong and what it meant for what could and could not be done. Clara listened and made a splint for his leg from branches and strips of her traveling shawl, and she wrapped his ribs as tight as she dared, and she mixed willow bark powder into boiled water and made him drink it while it was still hot enough to be useful. "You've done this before," he said, watching her hands. "Many times." "You're a doctor?" "No. My mother was a healer. I was her student from the time I was 8 years old. She taught me everything she knew because she said the world would always need someone who could put people back together." Clara tied off the last bandage. She wasn't wrong. "Where is she now?" "Dead. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She said it the way she said most things, directly, without performance. She sat back and looked at what she'd accomplished and made a quick internal accounting. Bleeding controlled, leg set, or set as well as it could be done without proper tools. Ribs bound, fire burning, water on. The situation was still genuinely bad. They were miles from help, with no way to send word, and the man she'd just kept alive was feverish and would likely get worse before morning. But it was a manageable kind of bad, the kind she knew how to handle. That was something. "James," she said, "does anyone know where you are?" Another of those pauses that was a beat too long. There are people at the ranch who'll notice I'm gone by morning." "Which ranch?" "Calloway Ranch. I work there." Clara went still. The fire crackled. Outside the cave entrance, the horse shifted and stamped once. "Is that so?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the Calloway Ranch is 12 miles west of Driftwood Creek?" "About that, yeah." "And Mr. Calloway himself, what's he like?" The man called James looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, complicated and careful, and not entirely comfortable. "What's your interest in Calloway?" "Curiosity." "He's a fair man," James said slowly. "Builds what he says he's going to build, pays what he says he's going to pay, doesn't make promises lightly. But he does make them. He does. And when he makes them, does he keep them?" James was quiet for a long time. The fire burned down slightly, and Clara fed it another branch. And when she looked back at him, his eyes were closed. But she could see from the tension in his jaw that he was not asleep, just not talking. "James, I heard you. Does he keep his promises?" "He tries to." A pause. "He's had reason to be careful. About people. About trust." "Most people have had reason to be careful," Clara said. "That doesn't excuse cowardice." His eyes opened. They were sharper now, more focused, and she had the sudden unsettling sensation that she was being assessed just as carefully as she'd assessed his injuries. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't." They didn't speak again for a while. Clara checked his wounds and fed the fire, and found the small canteen in his saddlebag. Half full, enough, and sat with her back against the cave wall, listening to the wind work through the canyon outside. The horse was quiet. The man called James breathed in the slow, careful way of someone managing pain with discipline rather than ease. "You said you had a destination," he said eventually. "I did." 12 miles west." "Yes." "And whoever was supposed to meet you didn't come." "We've established that." "But you burned the letters anyway." He glanced at her coat pockets, where the ribbon that had held the bundle was still visible. "I saw you. Before the rock came down, I saw you. At the edge of town." Clara turned to look at him. He met her gaze without flinching. "Then you should have come and introduced yourself," she said. "Would have saved us both a great deal of trouble." Something happened to his face then, something complicated and painful that had nothing to do with broken ribs, and he looked away first. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "I reckon it would have." The fire burned. The canyon wind moved. Clara Voss sat in the dark with a man whose name was not James Cole, who had watched her from a distance and said nothing and done nothing, and whose silence had cost them both. And she did not yet know all of this with certainty, only with the quiet, irrefutable certainty of a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated and has therefore learned to see clearly what other people miss. She knew the shape of the lie even before she knew its name. She had always been good at accounting. By midnight, the fever came on hard. He shook with it, teeth clenched, eyes glassing over. And Clara put her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him like a stove, and said quietly, with the calm that had gotten her through 12 years of emergencies, "You are going to be angry that this is happening to you, and that is fine. But it will not change anything. So we are going to get through it together. Are we clear?" "I'm not—" He stopped, breath hitching. "I'm not a man who likes being managed." "I know. I don't care. Drink this." She held the willow bark tea to his lips. He drank it. "Good. You're not what I expected," he said. The fever was making him less guarded, the words coming looser, less controlled. "You don't know what you expected. You never met me." "I read your letters." She looked at him steadily. "Did you?" His eyes found hers, brown and dark and honest, in a way the rest of his face hadn't quite managed yet. "Every word," he said. 4 times at least. Clara's hand stayed where it was, steady on his arm, keeping him still. Her expression did not change. But something shifted behind her eyes, a tiny movement, like a door that has been closed for a long time, opening just enough to let in air. "Sleep," she said. "We'll deal with the rest of this in the morning." "I'm sorry," he said, or she thought he said it. His voice was dropping, the fever pulling him under. "Clara, I'm sorry." She sat beside him through the night with her hand on his wrist and her mother's journal open in her lap, and the fire burning between them, and the wind talking in the canyon outside. And she did not sleep, and she did not cry, and she did not decide anything. She just stayed. Because that was what she did. It was what she had always done. And no man's failure to show up, no broken promise, no cowardice hidden behind a false name in the dark. None of it was going to change that about her. Clara Voss had come 12 miles through a canyon alone with $4 and a burned bundle of letters, and she had found this man bleeding on the ground, and she had stayed. That was who she was. Not who she was trying to be, not who she was hoping someone would eventually see. Who she already was, had always been, before anyone thought to look. The fire kept burning. The man slept. And Clara Voss, who had crossed half a country on a promise that was already ash, pressed her fingers to a pulse she was determined to keep going, and waited for morning. The fever broke just before dawn, not gradually but all at once, the way storms end in Wyoming. Sudden and complete, the heat leaving him like something had made a decision. Clara felt the change in his pulse before she saw it in his face. A steadying, a deepening, the frantic speed slowing to something that felt more like a man and less like a machine running past its limits. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 6 hours. He slept properly after that. Real sleep, not the restless burning thing that had been passing for it. Clara set down his wrist, rolled her shoulders back against the cave wall, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of doing nothing. Then she stood, fed the last of the wood to the fire, and went to check the horse. The roan was fine. Patient animal. The kind that had clearly been through difficult nights before and had made peace with the fact that difficult nights happened. Clara gave it water from the canteen and ran her hand along the cut on its shoulder, already clotting, not deep enough to cause lasting trouble, and stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, thinking about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew the man's name was not James Cole. She was certain of this, the way she was certain of sums that added up wrong. Not because she could prove the error, but because the numbers didn't balance, and she had enough experience with numbers to trust that instinct. The pause when she'd asked his name, the way he'd said it, the way he'd caught himself when she'd asked about Calloway and said, "my," before correcting to, "there are people." She also knew he'd watched her at the edge of town, had seen her burn the letters, had said nothing, had let her walk into the canyon alone. She was turning this over in her mind, examining it from different angles, when she heard him stir. "You're still here." His voice was rough from the night, but clear. The fever fog was gone. "I said I would be." Clara came back into the cave and crouched beside him, pressing her palm briefly to his forehead. Cool, or near enough. "How's the pain?" Present. He shifted, and she could see him cataloging his own damage the same way he had the night before, systematic and unsentimental. "Ribs are the worst of it." "They will be for a while. Broken ribs don't have a shortcut." She poured water into the tin cup and handed it to him. "Drink all of it." He drank without arguing, which told her the fever had cost him more than he'd let on. When he finished, he handed the cup back and looked at her with eyes that were fully present now, assessing, the same quality of attention she'd felt from him the night before, but no longer blurred by pain and illness. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept a little." "That's not what I asked." Clara met his gaze. "I slept enough. Stop redirecting." "I wasn't—" He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, a small thing, but she caught it, the beginning of a smile that he'd decided against. "All right. What do you need from me?" "Your real name would be a start." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that happens when a person has been caught, and knows it, and is deciding how much to admit. Clara waited it out. She was good at waiting. "James," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "You said that name like you were picking it off a shelf," Clara said. Like you needed something close enough to the truth that you'd answer to it naturally. She kept her voice even, matter of fact. I've met people who lie before. I've worked with frightened children who lied about who'd hurt them because they were scared of what the truth would cost them. You have that same quality right now. So I'll ask again. What's your name? He looked at her for a long time. Outside, a hawk called once from somewhere high up, sharp and carrying. His jaw worked. Seth, he said. Seth Calloway. Clara nodded once, as though this confirmed something she'd already filed. All right. She stood and moved to the fire to add the last few scraps of wood. Then the horse is yours. The ranch 12 miles west is yours. And you watched me burn your letters at the edge of town and didn't say a word? Clara, I'm not finished. She turned around and looked at him, and her voice was not raised, was not shaking, was not anything except direct. You wrote to me for 3 months. You asked me questions no one had ever thought to ask. You wrote about partnership and honesty, and not wasting each other's time with pretty lies. She paused. And then you stood at the edge of a town and watched a woman you'd invited across half a country walk into a canyon alone because you were too afraid to say your own name. Seth's face had gone tight. He didn't look away, which she gave him credit for. Yes, he said. That's what I did. Why? Not a question. A demand for the real answer, not the comfortable one. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then, I had a partner, 3 years ago. Woman I was going to marry. I trusted her completely, with the accounts, with the decisions, with everything. Thought I knew her. His voice stayed flat, but flatness in a voice like his was its own kind of telling. She and my business partner cleaned out half the herd and left the same week. Left me with a loan I could barely service and a real clear picture of exactly how wrong my judgment could be. So you decided your judgment couldn't be trusted? I decided I needed to see for myself who you actually were, not who you were willing to be in a letter to a man with money and land. And how were you going to see that, Clara said, while standing 60 yards away at the edge of a town? The question landed the way she'd meant it to. Precise, without cruelty, but without mercy either. Seth closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something raw there, something that had stopped trying to manage itself. I don't have a good answer for that. No, you don't. Clara sat down across from him, close enough to check his color, far enough to make it clear this was not a comfortable conversation. What I'd like to know, Seth, is what you were hoping to see. What was the test? What would have made you step forward? He looked at the fire for a moment. I didn't have a test exactly. I needed to see you. Not the letters. You. How you moved through a situation you hadn't planned for. Whether you were solid when things went wrong. And watching a woman walk into a canyon alone tells you that? I wasn't... He stopped. Tried again. I was going to follow. Make sure you were safe. I told myself I'd come in behind, and if anything went wrong... He broke off, and the look on his face was the look of a man hearing himself clearly for the first time, and not thinking much of what he hears. Then the wall came down, and then there was nothing. Then I found you, bleeding in the rock. Yes. And you lied about your name. Yes. Even then. Even then. He held her gaze. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man who was afraid, Clara said, and let that fear make him cruel without meaning to. She watched his face when she said it, looking for defensiveness, for the flinch toward excuse. Instead, what she got was something quieter. A man absorbing a truth he'd already mostly arrived at on his own, and hearing it from outside himself for the first time. "That's fair," he said. Clara pulled her mother's journal into her lap, more for something to do with her hands than because she needed to read it. "I've spent my whole life being careful with men who had power over my situation. My whole life moving quietly, not taking up space, being grateful for whatever was offered and not asking for more." She didn't look up. "And I answered your advertisement because you wrote like a man who actually saw that and wanted something different, who wanted a partner, not a piece of furniture that could also cook. That's what I want." "I know. I believe you. And I also believe you stood at the edge of a town and watched me burn your letters and couldn't make yourself walk 20 yards to tell me who you were." She finally looked up. "Both of those things are true, Seth, and I don't know yet what to do with that." He didn't try to talk her through it. That was, she thought, something in his favor. He didn't reach for words to paper over the gap. He just sat with it, the way the land out here seemed to sit with difficult weather, not pretending it wasn't happening, just enduring. They heard the riders just after mid-morning. Clara heard them first. She was outside refilling the canteen from the seep she'd found lower in the canyon, and the sound of hoofbeats on stone carried far in the stillness. She came back into the cave at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was close. "Someone's coming. Multiple horses. From the east." Seth had pushed himself more upright against the cave wall, jaw set with the effort. "My foreman. Has to be Marcus. He would have sent riders at first light when I didn't come back." He looked at her. Clara. She was already reaching for her carpet bag, setting it in order, organizing the makeshift medical supplies with the quick economy of someone who'd been doing this long before she had words for it. "I heard you." "What are you going to tell them?" She looked at him. "The truth. That I found you in the canyon. That your name is Seth Calloway. That you have a broken leg, 2 broken ribs, and a shoulder wound that'll need cleaning properly when we get you somewhere with real supplies." A pause. "Unless you'd like to tell them you're James Cole." He didn't smile, but something in the corners of his eyes moved. "No, I think James has served his purpose." "Good. Lie still. You're not walking to that horse regardless of what your pride has to say about it." "Yes, ma'am." 3 riders came around the bend in the canyon, and Clara stepped out to meet them before they could ride past. The lead rider pulled up sharply, a weathered man in his 50s on a dark bay, with the look of someone who had been working cattle country long enough that very little surprised him. He surprised quickly enough when he saw Clara. "Ma'am," he touched his hat. "Beg your pardon, we're looking for—" "Seth Calloway. He's in the cave behind me. Broken leg, broken ribs, shoulder laceration. He had a fever through the night, but it broke before dawn. He's going to need a wagon. He cannot ride." She said it all at once, efficiently, watching his face move from surprise through assessment to something that looked like respect. "Are you Marcus?" "I am." He swung down from the horse. "And you'd be—" "Clara Voss." He went still. Not much, just a fraction, but she'd trained herself to catch small stillnesses. "Miss Voss." Something crossed his face. Recognition. And then a careful neutrality that told her he knew exactly who she was and what her presence in this canyon meant. "You arrived yesterday." "I did. Mr. Calloway was not at the station." Marcus met her eyes steadily. He was not a man who flinched from difficult things, she could see that. He also was not a man who lied when the truth was sitting right in front of him. "No, ma'am, he wasn't." "No." She held his gaze for one more beat. "He wasn't. But here we are. Can you get a wagon to this point, or do we need to carry him out to the wider section of trail?" "Tom." Marcus turned to the youngest of the 3 riders. "Ride back, get the flatbed, and bring Doc Hennessy if he's in town." He turned back to Clara. "Miss Voss, I want you to know, the ranch has been expecting you. Your room's been ready for 2 weeks." Clara absorbed this without expression. 2 weeks. Yes, ma'am. 2 weeks, which meant he'd had time, had known exactly when she was arriving, had prepared a room, had prepared, apparently, a great many things, and had still chosen not to stand on that platform. She nodded once, brisk and businesslike. "Let's get him stable first, then we'll sort out the rest." Inside the cave, Marcus crouched beside Seth and looked him over with the eye of a man who'd seen injury before and needed accurate information. "How bad, boss?" "Bad enough." Seth's voice was steady but tight. "Legs useless. Ribs make breathing an adventure. Shoulders the least of it." He looked at Marcus with something direct and uncomfortable in his expression. "She set the leg last night. Kept the infection down. I'd have been a deal worse without her." "I can see that." Marcus glanced at Clara, who was rewrapping the shoulder wound with fresh strips torn from her last clean blouse, and whatever he thought about that, he kept behind his eyes. "You're lucky she came through the canyon." "Yes," Seth said. He was watching Clara's hands. "I am." She didn't look up. "Hold still." The 2 remaining riders helped move Seth to the wider section of trail, an operation that cost him more than he let on. She could see it in the white line of his mouth and the way his hands gripped the makeshift litter rather than hung loose. But he didn't say a word that wasn't necessary, and he didn't tell her to be more careful, and he didn't pretend it hurt less than it did. She gave him that much. While they waited for the wagon, Marcus came to stand beside her, hat in hand. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. I'm not sure anyone here owes me much, except the man on that litter." "Maybe." Marcus looked out at the canyon walls. "But I'd like you to understand something about Seth Calloway. Because I've worked for him 9 years, and I've watched him build that ranch from next to nothing. And I've watched him hold it together after everything that woman took from him." He paused. "He's not a coward, Miss Voss. What he did, yesterday, the name, all of it, that's a man who's been wrong before in a way that cost him everything and couldn't make himself be wrong again." "I understand that," Clara said. "I understand it completely. That doesn't make it not cowardly." Marcus looked at her, and his expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "No, ma'am. I reckon it doesn't." The wagon arrived with the doctor an hour later. Doc Hennessy was a small, quick man who examined Seth's leg, resplinted it properly with materials from his bag, pronounced Clara's initial work as good as he'd have done himself under the same conditions, and then gave Seth a look of profound exasperation that clearly had history behind it. "You know better than to check the North Canyon alone after a storm," he said. "I know," Seth said. "I've set your leg 3 times in 9 years. This stops being funny." "It was never funny." "No, it wasn't." Doc Hennessy closed his bag. "Thank this woman. She kept you alive through a night that could have gone several different ways, none of them good." He looked at Clara. "You have medical training?" "My mother was a healer. I assisted her from childhood." "You've got good hands and good instincts. That's rarer than training." He touched his hat. "I run a small surgery in town. If you're staying in the territory, I'd be glad of the help on difficult cases." Clara looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, something loosened slightly in her chest. Not relief exactly, something closer to possibility. "I'll consider that," she said. They loaded Seth into the wagon bed with enough cushioning to keep the leg stable. Clara climbed in after, no one suggested otherwise, and sat at a distance from him that was practical and not personal, and probably fooled no one. The wagon started moving. The canyon walls rolled past.
"Doc offered you work," Seth said.
He did.
"That's not nothin' out here. Good work's hard to come by."
I noticed. A pause. The wagon hit a rut, and he caught his breath, controlled it, let it out. "Clara." She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said. "And I'm going to say it badly, because I don't say things like this often. And I'm also in significant pain." "Yes, that." He held her gaze. "What you did last night. Staying. Keeping me alive when you had every reason to walk out of that canyon and never look back. I know what that cost you. I know what you gave up to even be here. And I know that none of what I did deserved any of it." His voice was even, but underneath it, like water moving under ice, she could hear the thing he was working to say plainly. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm just saying, I know what it was." Clara looked at him for a moment. The canyon was opening up now, the walls pulling back, the sky widening above them.
"You're right," she said finally. "You do say things badly."
Something moved in his face. "Yeah."
"But you said it."
She looked back at the trail ahead. "That's more than most men manage." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from what it had been in the cave. Not the silence of two strangers managing a crisis. Something with more room in it, more air, like the land itself out here, wide enough to hold difficult things without them pressing quite so hard. The ranch came into view as the afternoon light turned gold, and Clara saw it for the first time and felt something land in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not wonder exactly, not relief, but a kind of recognition. Here is a thing built by someone who meant it. She could see it in the way the main house sat on the rise, solid and unadorned, and in the outbuildings arranged with practical logic rather than show, and in the way the land rolled away from it in all directions with the quality of land that has been worked and understood. Whatever else Seth Calloway was, he had built something real. She was not ready to decide what that meant. She was not ready to decide anything. But she looked at the ranch and she didn't look away. And when the wagon pulled up to the front of the main house and a woman appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with eyes that took everything in at once, Clara straightened her back and picked up her carpet bag and climbed down from the wagon on her own. "Miss Voss," the woman came forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Ruth Hardwick. I run the household here, and I live on the neighboring property. I've been expecting you since yesterday morning." She looked Clara over with the frank assessment of a woman who didn't have time for pretense. "You look like you've had a genuine ordeal." "I have," Clara said, "but I'm standing." Ruth looked at her for one more beat. Then she said, "Good. Women who keep standing are the ones worth knowing." She turned toward the wagon where the hands were beginning the complicated work of unloading Seth. "Is he going to live?" "Yes." "Did you keep him alive?" "Yes." Ruth nodded as though this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Then come inside. I'll get you something to eat and something to drink, and you can tell me exactly what happened. And then we're going to have a very direct conversation about what happens next." She held the door open, and something in her manner made the gesture feel less like hospitality and more like the opening of a negotiation. "Because I've known Seth Calloway for 7 years, Miss Voss, and I've watched him make one genuinely foolish decision after another when it comes to trusting people. And I'm not planning to stand by and watch him throw away the best thing that's happened to this ranch in a long time, without at least making sure you know you have options." Clara looked at her,
I always know I have options.
Ruth smiled then, a real one, sharp and warm at the same time. Yes, she said, I can see that about you. She stepped back from the door. Come in then. We've got a great deal to talk about. Clara stepped across the threshold of Calloway Ranch with her carpetbag in her hand and the ash of burned letters still faintly on her coat sleeve. And she made no promises, and she made no decisions. But she walked in with her spine straight and her eyes open, and she didn't look back. Ruth Hardwick fed Clara salt pork and cornbread and black coffee strong enough to stand the spoon in. And she did it without fuss or ceremony, setting the plate down and sitting across the table and watching Clara eat with the frank attention of a woman taking accurate measure of something. Clara ate everything on the plate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. And she wasn't going to pretend otherwise to seem more composed. Composure that required pretending wasn't worth much. Seth's been corresponding with you for 3 months, Ruth said, when Clara set down her fork. He has. And he didn't meet you at the station. No. Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I told him it was a fool's errand. Watching instead of meeting. Told him straight to his face. She paused. He listened the way he always listens when he's decided he's going to do something, regardless. Very politely, absolutely not changing his mind.
What did he think he was going to learn? Clara asked. From a distance.
He thought he was going to see who you were when no one important was watching. Ruth said it without judgment, just fact. After Nora, he stopped trusting his own instincts about people. Thought if he could see you in a situation you hadn't prepared for, he'd know something real. She looked at Clara over the rim of her cup. Of course, what he actually saw was you burning his letters and walking into the canyon alone, and he still didn't move.
No.
Because he was afraid.
Yes.
Ruth set down her cup. Does that make you angry? Clara considered the question honestly. It makes me tired, she said. Anger takes more than I have right now. What I mostly feel is clear, like something I was uncertain about is now certain, even if what it's certain about isn't comfortable. What's certain? That I made a real decision coming here, that I'm not going to let one man's fear define whether it was worth making. Clara looked at her. And that I'm not going to spend the next month being careful around Seth Calloway, in the hope that making myself small will make this easier. That's not who I am. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, No, I can see that it isn't. She stood and refilled both their cups. I'm going to tell you something about this ranch, Miss Voss, that Seth won't tell you because he's got too much pride and too much habit of carrying things alone. She sat back down. The note on the loan comes due in 4 months. Warren Cole at the First Territorial Bank has been waiting for Seth to miss a payment for 2 years. He wants this land. The water rights alone are worth 3 times what Seth owes, and Cole knows it. She held Clara's gaze. If this fall roundup doesn't go right, if the numbers don't come in close to what Seth needs them to, Cole is going to have the legal standing to press, and Seth is going to be in a fight he can't win from a sickbed with a broken leg. Clara set down her coffee cup. How short is he on hands for the roundup? He lost 2 men last month, one to an injury, one who took a better offer up in Montana. He needs at least 3 more who know cattle work before the end of October. That's 5 weeks. Yes. And he's going to be on crutches for 6. At least 6. Doc Hennessy wasn't optimistic. Ruth watched her. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, or to pull you into a situation that's not yours. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what you walked into. What it actually is, not what it looked like in letters. Clara was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch. Men's voices, horses, the practical noise of a working operation that was currently short 2 hands and its owner, and functioning anyway because the work didn't stop for personal difficulty. She recognized that quality. She'd lived inside it for 12 years. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me straight. I don't know another way to tell things." Ruth stood, picking up the plates. "Your room is at the top of the stairs, first door on the right." Seth picked out what's in the wardrobe himself. Spent a genuine amount of time on it, which for Seth Calloway is its own kind of statement. She paused, her back to Clara. He's not a man who does things by half measures when he decides to do them. The problem is deciding. Clara climbed the stairs alone. The room was everything Ruth hadn't described and didn't need to. She could see the care in it, the particular attention of someone who had read her letters and remembered what was in them, and translated that into choices. The books on the shelf were the kind she'd mentioned wanting. The writing desk faced east, the way she'd said she preferred. It was, she thought, either very thoughtful or very calculated, and she wasn't yet certain which, and she was too tired to sort it out tonight. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, Seth Calloway was waiting for a conversation she hadn't agreed to have. He was in the chair by the window of his room when she came to check his wound dressings the next morning, Doc Hennessy having asked her before he left to keep the shoulder clean until he could return in 3 days. Seth was upright, which was more than he should have been, and he was watching the door when she opened it, with the expression of a man who has spent the last several hours preparing what he wants to say, and is now uncertain any of it is adequate. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." Clara came in, set down the supplies she'd gathered from Doc Hennessy's kit, and moved to his shoulder without ceremony. "This is going to pull." "I know." She worked in silence for a moment, removing the old dressing, checking the wound's edges. It was clean, better than she'd expected, given the conditions of the night before. She began applying fresh salve, and the quietness between them had a weight to it that was different from the cave. Less urgent, more deliberate. 2 people who had time now, and weren't quite sure what to do with it. "I want to explain something," Seth said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He waited until she looked at him. "Nora, the woman I told you about. She came through Driftwood Creek on her way somewhere else, and stayed because she said she loved the land. Said it was exactly what she'd always wanted. Said she could see herself here forever." His voice was even, but stripped of something, the way wood gets stripped by weather over years. "Every word she said was what I needed to hear, and I believed all of it because I wanted to. Because I was so damn tired of building something alone." He paused. "When she left, she didn't just take money. She took my ability to trust what I felt, because I'd felt certain about her. Completely certain. And I was wrong." Clara tied off the dressing. She didn't sit down, but she didn't move away either. "So you decided certainty wasn't safe?" "I decided my version of certainty wasn't safe. That I needed something more than feeling." He looked at his hands. "When I read your letters, I felt that certainty again. That feeling of, this is real. This person is real. And it terrified me, because I'd felt it before." "And it was wrong before?" "Yes." "So you watched me instead of meeting me," Clara said. "Tried to find certainty through observation rather than trust." "Yes." "And then the canyon wall came down." "Yes." "And you still lied about your name." He was quiet. "Even half dead," he said finally, "I was still trying to control it. Still trying to see who you were before you could see who I was. I know how that sounds."
It sounds like a man who's been hurt, Clara said, and who let that hurt make his decisions for longer than it should have. She picked up the extra bandaging, folding it with precise economical motions. I understand it, Seth. I'm not certain I forgive it yet, but I understand it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to be honest now, completely, without the watching and the waiting and the management. Something in his voice went rougher. I'd like to try that, if you're willing. Before Clara could respond, boots sounded on the stairs, and Marcus appeared in the doorway, with the look of a man carrying news he'd rather not be carrying. Sorry to interrupt, boss. We've got a situation. Seth straightened immediately, the shift from personal to operational happening in him the way Clara imagined it always did, fast and complete. What kind? Warren Cole rode out. He's downstairs. Marcus glanced at Clara, then back to Seth. He heard about the accident. Heard you're laid up. A pause. He brought papers. The air in the room changed. Clara felt it. Seth felt it. She could see it in the way his jaw set and his hands gripped the arms of the chair. What kind of papers? The kind with the lawyer's name on them. He's calling the note. Says the injury constitutes an event of operational incapacity under the loan terms. Says he's got the right to demand early settlement. Marcus's voice was careful and controlled, but underneath it ran something cold. He wants the land assessed. Says he'll give Seth 60 days. Seth's face went through several things in quick succession. Fury, and then a hard, flat calculation. And then something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting the same battle from different angles for years and can feel it turning against him. I'll come down. Doc said, I'll come down, Marcus. Clara looked at Seth. Seth looked at Clara. Something passed between them that was not yet trust, but was in the same territory. A shared recognition of what was actually happening, and what it meant, and what came next. Don't, Clara said. He frowned. Don't what? Don't go down there angry and injured and let Warren Cole see exactly how much leverage he has over you. She held his gaze. Let me go down first. Clara, I managed accounts for an institution for 3 years. I know loan terms. I know what operational incapacity means, and what it doesn't mean, and how much it depends on the exact language of the contract. She was already moving toward the door. Where are the ranch papers? Study, left-hand drawer of the desk. But you can't just bring me the deed and the loan agreement, she said to Marcus. I'll be with Mr. Cole in the front room. She left before Seth could argue further. Warren Cole was a man who had learned that the right suit of clothes in the right territory could do more work than a weapon, and he dressed accordingly. Neat, expensive in a restrained way, the kind of man who made every space feel slightly like his office. He was standing in the front room of the Calloway ranch house, holding his hat and looking at the walls, with the expression of a man performing a quiet appraisal, and when Clara walked in, he turned with the polished surprise of someone who had expected to be waiting longer. Miss... He stopped. Clara Voss. She didn't offer her hand. I understand you've brought papers for Mr. Calloway. Cole's eyes moved over her with the quick efficiency of someone taking inventory. I'm here to see Seth Calloway. Mr. Calloway is recovering from an injury and is not currently receiving visitors on business matters. I'm managing the household accounts in his absence. You can speak with me, or you can come back in a week when he's more mobile. Either way, I'd like to see the papers. A pause. Cole looked at her steadily, recalibrating. And your position here is what, exactly? Currently? The person in this room who's read the loan agreement. Marcus had appeared silently in the doorway behind her and handed her the folder before disappearing again, and she opened it without looking away from Cole, found the relevant clause with the speed of someone who had been cross-referencing documents since she was 14, and read it twice.
The operational incapacity provision requires a period of no less than 30 days of documented inability to manage ranch operations before it can be invoked. Mr. Calloway was injured yesterday. You're here today. She closed the folder and held it at her side. That's not 30 days, Mr. Cole. That's not close to 30 days. Something moved in Cole's face. Not quite respect, not quite irritation. Something between them. The provision also allows for reasonable anticipation of incapacity duration, based on documented medical assessment. Clara tilted her head slightly. Doc Hennessy has not filed any assessment with your bank. To my knowledge, he hasn't been asked to. You're making an anticipatory claim without the documentation the contract requires. She paused. I'd be careful about that. Courts in territorial Wyoming have held that premature invocation of loan terms constitutes a breach on the lender's side in at least 2 cases I'm aware of. You'd know your own exposure better than I would. The room was very quiet. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, that was clear. And he was recalculating something. She could see it in the careful stillness of his face. You have a sharp understanding of financial agreements, Miss Voss, for someone who's been in Wyoming territory for less than 48 hours. I have a sharp understanding of financial agreements, Clara said, because I've spent 12 years keeping an institution solvent on a budget that would make most men weep. The territory is new. The math is the same. Another pause. Then Cole picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table and held it with both hands, a gesture that somehow managed to look like a graceful retreat rather than a defeat. Mr. Calloway is fortunate in his household management, he said. Yes, Clara said, he is. After Cole left, the silence in the front room had a different quality. Lighter, with some of the pressure gone out of it. Ruth appeared from the kitchen with the expression of someone who had been listening from the hallway and felt no particular guilt about it. Well, Ruth said. Well, Clara agreed. You want to tell me where you learned to read a loan agreement like that? The orphanage I grew up in was badly managed financially by the board for the last 4 years of its operation. I taught myself to read the contracts because nobody else was going to, and I filed 2 formal objections that bought us 18 months. Clara folded the papers back into the folder. It's still closed, but it closed on our terms, not theirs. Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman revising an estimate upward. Seth doesn't know any of that. No, he knows what I told him in the letters, which was that I managed accounts, not the context. Clara set the folder on the table. I wasn't hiding it. I just didn't think it was... I didn't know if it would be relevant. It's relevant, Ruth said. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, uneven, the sound of a man navigating crutches he was not yet used to and wouldn't admit were necessary. Seth appeared in the doorway of the front room, shirt untucked, hair unaddressed, face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been lying in bed listening to a conversation he couldn't participate in and has arrived too late to be useful. His eyes went from Ruth to Clara to the empty space where Cole had been standing. He's gone? Seth said. He's gone, Clara confirmed. What did you say to him? That his invocation of the incapacity clause was premature under the contract terms, and that he was exposing himself to a counterclaim. She handed him the folder. Your loan language is actually favorable on that point. Someone negotiated it well. Marcus's cousin is a lawyer. Seth took the folder but didn't open it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Something unguarded and disoriented. The face of a man who had built a very thorough understanding of how things worked and has just watched it turn out to be incomplete. You read the whole agreement. The relevant sections.
The rest I can go through this evening." "Clara," he stopped, seemed to be searching for something and not finding the right shape for it. "I had no idea you—" "I know." She said it without edge. "You knew I managed accounts. You didn't know what that meant in practice. Because I didn't tell you, and because—" She paused, choosing the next words carefully. "Because I've spent my whole life offering people the modest version of what I am so they'd be comfortable. Giving them just enough to justify keeping me around, without giving so much that they'd feel threatened." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to do that here. If I stay, you get the actual version. All of it."
"Even the parts that are inconvenient." Seth held her gaze. The crutches took his weight, and she could see the effort that cost him, the pain he was managing with the same flat discipline he'd used in the cave. But he didn't step back, didn't reach for anything easier to say. "What do you need from me," he said, "for you to decide to stay?" It was the right question. Not a plea, not a negotiation. A genuine request for information from a man who wanted to solve the actual problem rather than the comfortable version of it. "Honesty," Clara said. "About everything. The debt, the ranch, what you need, what you can't do alone. No managed version, no careful omissions." She took a breath. "And time. I'm not going to make a decision about my life in a week because you're charming and the room is nice. I need to see how this place actually runs, what the work actually is, whether I can respect you when things are hard and not just when you're grateful." "That's fair. I'm not finished. I also want to speak with Doc Hennessy about assisting with his cases. Not as a favor or a pastime, as real work, with real standing. If I'm going to build a life in Wyoming territory, I'm going to build all of it, not just the domestic half." Seth absorbed this. "Done." "You agreed to that fast?" "Because it's a reasonable request, and I'd have to be an idiot to argue with it." Something moved in his voice. "I have been an idiot about some things. I'm trying to be precise about which ones." Despite herself, despite everything, Clara felt something shift in the tight place behind her sternum. Not a melting, nothing that soft. Something more like ice giving way to moving water. Still cold, still capable of resistance, but no longer quite so still. "All right," she said. "Then we start there." What she didn't say, what she wasn't ready to say, was that she had already started. That walking into Warren Cole's polished certainty, with a loan agreement she'd read in 4 minutes, had felt more like herself than anything had in years. That this rough, difficult, financially precarious ranch in the middle of Wyoming territory felt more like somewhere she could exist at full size than any place she'd been in her 26 years of careful smallness. That the man leaning on crutches in the doorway, stubborn and ashamed, and trying hard to be better than his worst decision, was already more known to her than most people she'd spent years alongside. She was not going to say any of that yet. She had learned, over a long life of being underestimated, that some things were worth saying at the right time rather than the first available moment. But she was thinking it, and that, she knew, was already something new. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Clara did not pretend they were. She had said she needed to see how the ranch actually ran, and she meant it. So she watched and worked and learned with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything else in her life. She was up before dawn most mornings, in the kitchen with Ruth, and by the time the hands came in for breakfast, she had already spent an hour at the desk in the study, going through the ranch ledgers with the focus of someone excavating something important from layers of accumulated dirt. The books were not a disaster, but they were close to one. Seth had been managing the numbers himself since he'd let his last foreman handle too much 2 years ago,
and paid for that trust in ways he still didn't entirely discuss. The entries were accurate. He was meticulous, she gave him that. But the organization was the organization of a man who understood cattle and land and weather, and understood money primarily as a thing that needed to exist in sufficient quantity for the other things to continue.
The larger strategic picture, the long-term structuring of debt and income that would have told him 6 months ago that Warren Cole's pressure was coming. That picture was missing. Clara built it. She worked backwards through 2 years of accounts and forward through projections, and what she assembled over 4 days of early mornings was a clear map of where the ranch actually stood versus where it needed to stand, and what the roundup needed to yield, and exactly how much room there wasn't. She put it on the desk in front of Seth on a Thursday morning and stood back and let him read it. He read it twice, the way she'd learned he read things that mattered to him. Then he set the papers down and looked at the window for a long moment, without speaking. "Well," he said finally. "Yes. That's tighter than I thought. By about $400 on the operational side and 6 weeks on the timeline." Clara sat down across from him. "The good news is that the herd count is solid. If Marcus can get the roundup done efficiently and the beef prices hold where they were in August, you clear the payment with enough left to carry through winter." She paused. "The margin is thin, but it's real. And if the prices drop, then we have a different conversation." She held his gaze. "But I'd rather have that conversation if it becomes necessary than spend energy on it now. Right now, the problem is the roundup, and the roundup problem is hands." Seth leaned back in his chair, and she could see the familiar tension of a man working through a problem he'd been working through already, alone, without the benefit of having it laid out clearly in front of him. "I've sent word to 3 outfits. Nobody available before the end of October." "I know. I saw the correspondence." Clara had read everything on that desk, which Seth had either not noticed or had chosen not to address. She suspected the latter. "Ruth mentioned there are 2 men in town who've done seasonal cattle work, but haven't found a full season's contract yet. Her nephew is one of them. Earl Hardwick." Seth's expression shifted slightly. "He's young. He's 22, and he knows cattle work. Ruth says he's reliable." She watched him. "Is there a reason beyond age?" A pause. "No." "Then I'd like to go to town and speak with them." Seth looked at her. "You'd like to go recruit ranch hands. Is that a problem?" He opened his mouth, and she could see him sorting through several responses, discarding the ones that were reflexive, and reaching for the one that was honest. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." "Good. I'll go this afternoon with Marcus." She stood. "Also, Doc Hennessy sent word this morning. He has a difficult confinement case, a woman out on the Beller homestead, and he'd like me to come." I said yes. "I'm telling you as a courtesy, not a request." "Clara." His voice stopped her at the door. When she turned, he was watching her with an expression she was learning to read. Not the guarded blankness of the first days, but something more open, something that had more edges to it, and therefore more truth. "Thank you. For the books. For Cole. For all of it." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to thank me for doing work I'm capable of." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She acknowledged that with a slight nod and left without answering, because the answer she had was not one she was ready to say out loud yet. The Beller confinement case took most of the afternoon and into the evening, and it was hard work. The baby was turned wrong, and the mother was exhausted and frightened, and Doc Hennessy worked with quiet, steady hands, while Clara kept the woman calm and alert, and managed the room with the same practical authority she developed over years of managing crises with whatever was available. The baby came just before sundown, small but breathing, furious about existence in the way that healthy newborns are. Clara cleaned the infant while Doc Hennessy saw to the mother, and she felt the small body against her hands, warm and outraged and complete. And something moved through her chest that was too large and too particular to have a simple name. On the way back, sitting beside Doc Hennessy in his wagon as the evening light went flat and gray over the territory, he said, "You've done this before."
"Many times."
"At the orphanage?"
"Yes, we had infants regularly. Some left at the door, some born there." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I assisted with every difficult birth for the last 4 years I was there."
"I could use you twice a week at minimum," Doc said. "There are homesteads out 30 miles that don't see a doctor for months at a stretch. A woman who can travel and handle complicated cases. That's not something this territory has much of." He glanced at her. "I can pay a modest fee. Not what you deserve, but what I can manage."
"I'm not looking to become wealthy," Clara said. "I'm looking to do work that matters."
"Then we're in agreement."
When she got back to the ranch, the kitchen was lit, and Ruth had left a covered plate for her on the table, and Seth's light was still on in the study. She stood in the kitchen and ate standing up, too tired to perform sitting, and she could hear through the wall the faint sound of Seth moving papers, the creak of his chair, the occasional knock of crutches that he was still navigating with the focused irritation of a man who deeply resented needing them. She knocked on the study door.
"Come in."
He was at the desk, account books open in front of him, and he looked up when she entered, with the expression of a man who had been half expecting her and was trying not to look like it.
"How was the Beller woman?"
"She's well. Healthy boy."
Clara sat in the other chair, the one she'd begun to think of as the working chair, where she sat when they were going through numbers together. "Earl Hardwick and his friend James Pruitt will start Monday. Marcus interviewed them this afternoon. He thinks they'll do." "Marcus has good judgment about people."
"Yes."
She paused. "Unlike some ranch owners he could name."
Seth looked at her. Something moved in his face, and then he laughed. A short, real sound, the kind that comes out before a person can manage it. And she found that she liked the sound of it considerably more than she'd expected to.
"That's fair," he said. "It usually is."
She leaned back in the chair. She was tired in a way that felt honest. The tiredness of having done a full day's work that mattered. And the tiredness sat differently than the exhaustion of the first weeks. "Doc Hennessy wants me twice a week." I told him yes.
"Of course you did."
"Seth."
"I meant that straightforwardly. Of course you said yes. It's what you should be doing." He held her gaze, and the humor had faded into something more direct. "I want you to have everything you came here to build, Clara. The work, the standing, all of it. That was true in the letters, and it's truer now." She looked at him for a moment.
"Why truer now?"
"Because in the letters I knew the idea of you. Now I know you." He said it simply, without performance, the way he said things when he wasn't trying to manage the outcome. "You read my loan agreement in 4 minutes and walked downstairs and handled Warren Cole better than I would have. You went out to a difficult confinement case on your second week in Wyoming and came back and ate standing up in the kitchen because you were too tired to sit down." A pause. "You dragged me half a mile through a canyon with a broken leg. You stayed up all night with a man who'd lied to you because he needed someone to stay." Clara didn't answer immediately. The lamp on the desk put warm light across the papers between them, and outside, the wind had picked up the way it did out here in the evenings, a sound that had stopped feeling foreign sometime in the second week without her noticing.
"I stayed because it was the right thing to do," she said.
"I know. That's why it mattered." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "Clara, I want to be honest about something."
"You usually are, lately."
"Lately, yes." He absorbed that. "I want to be honest that I am aware that you're here on complicated terms, and that the situation is not what you agreed to when you bought your train ticket, and that you owe me nothing. Considerably less than nothing, actually. His voice was careful, measured, each word chosen with the same precision he brought to everything he genuinely cared about. And I don't want you to stay because you feel obligated, or because you've put too much in to walk away, or because the alternatives feel harder than they should be. I want you to stay because you want to, and I want to know if that's possible. The directness of it caught her, the way his directness always caught her. She was not accustomed to men who said exactly what they meant without softening it into something easier to refuse. I don't know yet, she said. I know that's not the answer you want. It's the honest answer. That's the one I want. What I know, Clara said, is that I have not been looking for an exit. I've been looking for reasons to stay, and I've been finding them. Not because of the room or the dresses in the wardrobe. She watched his face when she said that, and something briefly uncomfortable moved through it. But because of the work. Because of Ruth and Doc Hennessy and the fact that I walked downstairs and argued loan terms with Warren Cole and felt more like myself than I have in years. She paused. And because you have been honest with me since the canyon, genuinely honest, even when it costs you. That's not nothing. It's the least I can do. It's more than most people manage. She met his eyes. I'm not there yet, Seth. I'm not going to pretend I am. But I'm also not leaving. And that's not a small thing from someone who has spent her whole life calculating exits. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me to get there? If there's a there. I need you to let me be what I am. All of it. Not to get nervous when I walk into a room and handle a situation you thought was yours to handle. Not to decide what I should know about the ranch and what I shouldn't. She held his gaze. I've been managed by careful men my whole life. They meant well, most of them. It was still a cage. I won't do that. If you start doing it without meaning to, tell me, he said immediately. Call me out on it. I'd rather know. He held her gaze with the flat, steady quality she'd come to recognize as him meaning something without reservation. I have been alone a long time, Clara. I've made every decision here by myself for years, and I'm used to that. And I will probably get it wrong sometimes. But I would rather get it wrong and hear about it than get it quietly right in a way that costs you something. She studied his face, the scar on his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into Wyoming weather, the particular look of a man who was telling the truth and knew it might not be enough, and was telling it anyway. All right, she said quietly. The following week brought the first hard test of what all right actually meant in practice. Marcus came to Seth on a Tuesday morning with a report about the North Pasture water situation. A creek diversion that needed to be addressed before the roundup, or they'd be moving cattle across dry ground in the third week of October. The fix required materials that cost money and a decision about whether to pull two of the newly hired hands off cattle prep to do the work. Seth made the decision over breakfast without consulting Clara, announced it to Marcus, and had it halfway implemented before Clara came in from Doc Hennessy's and found out from Ruth what had happened. She went to find Seth in the barn, where he was watching the hands work from a position slightly too close to the horses for someone still on crutches, and she stood in the doorway until he noticed her. He read her face in approximately 2 seconds. I should have talked to you first. Yes. I know the accounting better now. I should have... He stopped. It was habit. I'm sorry. Clara looked at him for a moment. This was the thing about Seth Calloway that she was still learning to navigate. He didn't defend, didn't deflect, didn't reach for excuse. When he was wrong, he said so with the same directness he brought to everything else. It was, she was finding, considerably harder to stay angry at a man who did that than at men who made her argue for the acknowledgement. The decision itself was correct, she said. I looked at the numbers when I got back. It's the right call." She crossed her arms. "I'm not here to second-guess your knowledge of this land. I'm here because two sets of eyes see more than one, and because I am capable of being useful to this decision-making process if you let me be." "I know." He held her gaze. "It won't happen again." "It will happen again," she said. "You're 60 years of habit into making decisions alone. It will happen again, and when it does, I'll tell you, and you'll stop. That's what we agreed to." Something in his face shifted, softened in a way she was starting to recognize as the expression he wore when she said something that surprised him by being true. "You're easier to talk to than anyone I've known," he said. "Have I mentioned that?" "You haven't, and easy to talk to is relative when you've apparently been talking to almost no one for several years." He laughed again, that same short, genuine sound. "Fair point." Ruth chose that afternoon to tell Clara, with the casual timing of a woman who had planned the moment with precision, that Seth had not been to the Harvest Social in Driftwood Creek in 3 years. Had not, in fact, been to a social gathering of any kind since Nora left. Had turned down every invitation, declined every supper, reduced his contact with the town to the purely transactional. Supplies, banking, the occasional necessity. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because the social is Saturday," Ruth said, "and the whole county comes. And if Seth Calloway shows up with you on his arm, it will say something to this community that words can't say as efficiently." Clara set down her mending. "What will it say?" "That he's done hiding." Ruth met her eyes. "And that you're not temporary." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I haven't decided I'm not temporary." "No," Ruth agreed. "But you're not leaving either. And out here, that counts for something." She picked up her own mending with the air of someone who has said what needed saying and is done with it. "I'm not pushing you toward anything. I just think you should know what it would mean. To him and to everyone who's watched that man eat alone for 3 years and wondered if he was going to be all right." Clara thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, she knocked on the study door and went in and said, without preamble, "Ruth tells me there's a social Saturday." Seth looked up from his papers. His expression went through something complicated. "She mentioned that to you." "She did. She has strong opinions about my social life. She has strong opinions about most things. I find it admirable." Clara stood in the doorway, hands at her sides, meeting his eyes with the directness that was her natural mode when she'd made up her mind about something. "I'd like to go." The shift in his face was immediate and unguarded, the look of a man who had stopped expecting things and is momentarily undone by receiving one. "With me?" "Yes. Unless you'd prefer I go alone and stand in the corner with Doc Hennessy all evening." No, He stopped, seemed to realize he was handling this with less composure than usual, and made a visible effort to recover it, which did not entirely succeed, and was therefore, she thought, considerably more genuine than if it had. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." "Good." She turned to go. "Clara," she turned back. He looked at her across the study, across the account books and the ledgers and the careful map she'd built of his financial situation, across the weeks of mornings and working meals and difficult conversations, and his face was open in a way she didn't think he opened it very often. "I know I haven't earned the right to say this yet," he said, "and I'm not saying it to press you toward anything. I'm saying it because you asked for honesty, and this is part of it." A pause. "I think you are the most genuinely capable person I have ever met. And I am glad you walked into that canyon. I am glad you stayed. And whatever you decide about the rest of it, I want you to know that." Clara stood in the doorway for a moment. The lamplight was warm on the papers between them. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the dark with a sound like something settling into place. "I know," she said quietly.
I'm starting to be glad too.
She left before he could see that she meant it more than she'd intended to admit. The Harvest Social at Driftwood Creek was held in the town hall on a Saturday evening in late October, and the whole county came, the way Ruth had said they would. Ranchers and homesteaders and tradespeople and their families, filling the long room with the noise and warmth of people who had spent months in isolated proximity to hard weather and were glad of the excuse to be together. Clara wore the green dress, not because Daniel had chosen it, because she had looked at it in the wardrobe on Friday morning and decided that wearing a thing did not mean being owned by the choosing of it, and because it fit her well, and the color suited her, and she was done making herself smaller to make a point. She wore it, and she pinned her hair up herself, and she came downstairs to find Seth waiting in the front hall in a dark coat she hadn't seen before, freshly shaved, his crutches traded out for a single walking stick that Doc Hennessy had finally allowed as a concession to his stubbornness. He looked at her the way he looked at the account books when the numbers finally balanced, with a kind of quiet, comprehensive relief. "You look," he started. "Don't make it complicated," Clara said. "Let's go." He smiled, and they went. The ride into town was the most ordinary thing they had done together, which made it, in its way, the most significant. No crisis, no canyon, no financial emergency requiring her to read contracts at speed. Just two people in a wagon on a clear October night, with the stars coming out, one at a time, over Wyoming territory, talking about small things, the herd numbers from the week's count, a letter she'd gotten from Doc Hennessy about a patient out on the Eller homestead, a book she'd found on the study shelf that she thought had probably been his mother's. Small talk. The kind that people who are building something together accumulate the way a house accumulates familiar furniture. Not dramatic in itself, but essential to the shape of daily life. She noticed that she was not calculating exits. The thought arrived without fanfare, somewhere between the first mile and the second, and she let it sit without examining it too hard. The way she'd learned to let things that mattered settle at their own pace, rather than pressing them into shape before they were ready. The hall was loud when they arrived, warm with lamplight and the smell of autumn cooking, and conversation stopped in the particular wave that moves through a room when something unexpected walks in. Clara felt it, the pause, the heads turning, the quick assessments being made, and she stood straight and kept her chin level and let them look. She had been invisible for 26 years. Being seen was not a thing she needed to manage. Seth put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they crossed the threshold, a gesture so unassuming she almost missed it. Not possessive, not performative, just the instinctive steadying of a man who was also being looked at and knew it, and was choosing, this time, not to step back from the looking. Ruth appeared from inside the crowd immediately, with the efficiency of a woman who had been watching the door. She took one look at both of them and said, "Good," with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has proved correct, and disappeared again. Doc Hennessy found them near the refreshment table, shook Seth's hand with the firm grip of a man making a statement, and told Clara that the Beller baby had gained 4 pounds, and that Mrs. Beller was calling him the finest healer in the territory, which Clara deflected, and Doc refused to let her deflect, and the small argument about it lasted long enough that a circle of interested listeners had accumulated without any of them quite noticing. The introductions came in waves after that. Ranch wives who looked at Clara with the frank curiosity of women in isolated country who understood exactly what it meant to have made the journey she'd made. Homesteaders who'd heard about the canyon and asked about it with varying degrees of delicacy. A woman named Margaret Pruitt, James Pruitt's mother it turned out, one of their new hands, who took Clara's hands in both of hers and said that her son had come home from his first week at Calloway Ranch, talking about the account books and the no-nonsense woman who was running them, and that she thought Seth Calloway had finally done something right. Clara thanked her and meant it,
and felt the warmth of it lodge somewhere it was going to stay. Warren Cole was there. Of course he was. He was a man who came to things, who maintained his visibility in the community with the same careful strategy he brought to everything else. He was across the room when Clara first saw him, talking to two men she didn't recognize, and he saw her at the same moment, and their eyes held for a brief second before he nodded, a small, precise acknowledgement, and looked away. She had won that exchange at the ranch, and they both knew it, and he was not a man who fought battles he'd already assessed as lost. What he was, she understood, was a man who was patient. The note on the loan had 60 days left on its new terms. The roundup still had to happen. The margin was still thin. She filed that thought where it belonged and went back to the conversation she was having. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Seth found her by the side door, where she'd stepped out for a moment of quiet after 2 hours of sustained sociability. He came up beside her without announcing himself, which she was learning was characteristic. He didn't signal his approaches, didn't clear his throat or call ahead, just appeared, in the way that people do when they're used to moving quietly through spaces that belong to them. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "At people. At making them feel like you're paying attention to them specifically." He leaned his weight on the walking stick, looking out at the dark. "I've watched you for 2 hours. You don't perform it. You actually are paying attention. My mother taught me that everyone has a story worth knowing." Clara looked at the stars. "I found it to be true. Even the difficult people. Even Warren Cole?" "Warren Cole has a story. It's probably not a sympathetic one, but it exists." She paused. "He's going to try again, Seth. Not tonight, not this month. But the pressure doesn't stop because I knew the contract language." "I know. The roundup has to go well." "It will." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has looked at the thing from every angle and made his decision. "Earl and Pruitt have been solid. Marcus thinks we can move the herd by the 15th. Prices are holding." He looked at her. "Your projections were right. We're going to make it." "We," she said, not correcting him, just noting it. He looked at her steadily. "We," he confirmed. "That's what I said." The word sat between them with more weight than its single syllable suggested, and neither of them rushed past it. Inside, the fiddle music had started up again, a reel that carried clearly through the wooden walls. They stood in the quiet outside it and listened for a moment, and then Seth said, "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do anyway." "That letter you wrote, the first one, before I'd responded, before there was any reason to think I'd respond at all." He looked at the dark. "You wrote 3 pages, about the orphanage, about your mother, about what you wanted your life to be. You weren't writing to impress me. You were writing because you had things that needed saying." "Yes," Clara said. "That's right." "Who were you writing to?" She considered the question. "Myself," she said finally. "I was writing to myself." I'd spent so long being quiet that putting words down in a letter to a stranger felt like the only place I could be loud without consequences. She paused. "I didn't know if you'd write back. I almost didn't send it." "I'm glad you did." He said it simply, the way he said things when they mattered. "I read it 4 times. I told you that in the canyon, and I meant it." "I know you meant it." "Do you believe it?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the open, undefended expression she'd first seen in the cave, when the fever had burned away his ability to manage himself, and that she'd been seeing more of since. Not because he'd stopped being a guarded man, but because he had decided, gradually and without announcement, that being guarded around her was both unnecessary and unaffordable. "Yes," she said. "I believe it." Something settled in his face. "Good," he said.
Then I want to say something else, and I'm going to say it out here, where it's quiet, and you can't be distracted by Margaret Pruitt's opinions about cattle rotation." Despite herself, despite everything, Clara smiled. "She does have strong opinions." "Everyone in this county has strong opinions. It's something about the altitude." He looked at her. "Clara, I want to ask you to stay. Not because the ranch needs what you bring to the books, though it does, and not because Doc Hennessy needs you, though he does, and not because Ruth has decided you're the best thing to happen to this property in a decade, though she has." He held her gaze with a particular steadiness that she'd come to understand was him being as honest as he knew how to be. "I want you to stay, because I am better when you're here. I make better decisions. I see things more clearly. I'm less alone in a way that's changed what the work feels like, what this place feels like." He paused. "And because I am asking you honestly, as the man I actually am, and not the managed version. Because you deserve that at minimum. You deserve the actual question from the actual person." Clara was quiet. The fiddle music drifted through the wall. Above them, the Wyoming stars were extravagant and indifferent and very beautiful. "You know what I've been thinking about," she said, "since the first morning I went through your account books?" "Tell me." "That this is the first place in my life where the work I can do matches the size of what actually needs doing." She looked at him. "At the orphanage, I was always larger than what I was permitted to be. I managed within limits set by people who thought they were doing me a kindness. Here," she paused, "here the limits are set by the land and the weather and the numbers. And those are honest limits. They don't pretend to be something else." "No," Seth said, "they don't. I want that. I want work that's real, and limits that are honest, and a life where what I know and what I can do is used rather than managed." She met his eyes. "I also want what I said from the beginning. A partner. Someone who makes decisions with me, not at me. Someone who tells me the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient." She paused. "Is that what you're offering? Not the letters, not the idea. Actually offering." "Yes," Seth said. "That is what I'm offering. All of it." She studied his face for a long moment. The scar on his jaw, the lines from years of Wyoming weather. The particular look of a man who has come to the end of a long and difficult walk and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Then yes," Clara said. "I'll stay." He let out a breath, slow and controlled, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for longer than the evening. Just like that. It's not just like that. It's 6 weeks and a canyon, and worn coal, and a broken leg, and more honest conversations than I've had in my entire life combined. Clara held his gaze. "That's not nothing, Seth. That's not just anything. That's enough." He reached for her hand, slowly, the way he did things when he was making sure. And she let him take it. And his grip was exactly what it had been in the cave, the first night, when he'd held her wrist and she'd checked his pulse. Warm and solid and present. "I'm going to get it wrong," he said. "I've told you that." "I know. So will I." She looked at their joined hands. "We'll tell each other when it happens." Every time. Every time. They went back inside, and the music was louder now, and Ruth caught Clara's eye from across the room with an expression that asked a question and received an answer without a word being exchanged between them, and she gave a single satisfied nod and went back to her conversation. Marcus, standing near the door with his hat in his hands, looked at Seth with the expression of a man who has been hoping for a particular outcome for quite some time and is glad to see it arrive. Doc Hennessy raised his glass from across the room. Seth led Clara onto the floor when the next song started, and he danced carefully, favoring his healing leg, and she matched his pace without making a thing of it, and they moved through the lamplight of the Driftwood Creek Town Hall while the whole county watched and drew the conclusions they were going to draw, regardless. Let them draw them. The conclusions were right. The roundup started the following Monday, and it was everything the numbers had predicted. Hard, efficient work that ran 6 days and yielded a count that made Marcus nod with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done exactly what he said he would do. Clara tracked the tally from the ranch, managing the incoming figures with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything. And when the final number came in on the 6th day, she did the calculation in her head, and then did it again on paper to be sure. And then she went to find Seth in the barn. He was brushing down his horse with the slow, careful movements of a man whose leg was still reminding him of its recent history. And he looked up when she came in. "Tell me," he said. "We cleared the payment by $240, Clara said, with enough left for winter operating costs and a small reserve." Seth was quiet for a moment. He set down the brush. "$240. Thin," she said, "but it's there." He nodded, once. The nod of a man receiving information he has been working toward for months, and is now integrating. Then he said, "Cole's going to come back next year." "Yes, he will." "And the year after." "Probably, until we're strong enough that pressing makes no sense." She looked at him. "That's the work. Not a single payment. Building the margin year by year until there's nothing for him to press on." "We," Seth said, like he'd said it the night of the social. "We," Clara confirmed, like she'd confirmed it then. He crossed the barn and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the particular quality of attention in his face, the look that meant he was about to say something he'd thought about carefully and decided to say anyway. "I want to ask you something properly. Not in the dark outside a social. Here. Now." "Seth, Clara Voss." His voice was even, but underneath it ran the same thing she'd heard in the cave. Water moving under ice, deep and real, and going somewhere. "I know what you left to come here. I know what it cost you. I know that you stayed and did work that mattered, and made this ranch survivable when I was on my back and unable to manage it. And I know that you did all of it without knowing how it would turn out." He looked at her with the unguarded steadiness that was the truest thing about him. "I want to marry you, not because it's expected, or because it would be practical, or because I want to give you the life I described in the letters. Because you are already building a life here that is entirely yours, and I want to be part of it. I want us to build the rest of it together, as equals, the way it should have been from the beginning." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the platform at Driftwood Creek, the ash of letters at her feet, and $4 in her reticule, and nowhere to go, and the particular quality of a fury that is cold and clarifying, rather than hot and consuming. She thought about the canyon, and the lever, and the long night tending a man who had lied about his name. She thought about the account books, and Warren Cole's careful retreat, and the Beller baby, warm and furious in her hands, and Doc Hennessy saying she had good instincts, and Ruth's single satisfied nod across a crowded room. She thought about what it felt like to be the actual size of herself in a place that had room for it. "Yes," Clara said. "I'll marry you, Seth Calloway." He kissed her then, in the barn with the horse watching and the October light coming through the gaps in the boards. And it was not a romantic thing in the performed sense. It was an honest thing, the way everything between them had finally become honest, solid and real, and built on ground that had been tested and held. They were married on a Thursday in November by the circuit preacher, in the front room of the ranch house, with Ruth and Marcus and Doc Hennessy as witnesses, and Earl Hardwick and James Pruitt standing in the doorway in their good shirts, looking pleased with themselves for reasons that had nothing to do with them. Clara wore a dress she had made herself. Not the green one, a new one, cream-colored, sewn from fabric she'd chosen with her own hands and her own money from the general store in Driftwood Creek. She had wanted this choice to be entirely hers. It was. She spoke her vows with the same directness she brought to everything, clearly, without adornment, looking Seth in the eye. He spoke his the same way, and they were the vows of two people who understood what they were promising, and had decided to promise it anyway. Not because it was simple, but because it was worth doing, even complicated. Outside the window, Wyoming stretched in every direction, vast and unforgiving, and full of difficult weather and honest limits and work that mattered. Inside, a woman who had spent 26 years being carefully small stood in the room of a house that was now hers as much as anyone's, surrounded by people who knew her actual name and the size of what she could do, and married a stubborn, scarred, finally honest man who had needed to nearly die in a canyon before he could stop being afraid of her. Clara Voss had burned his letters on a train platform in September with $4 in her pocket and nowhere to go. Clara Calloway signed the marriage register in November with the full knowledge of what she was and what she was worth and what she intended to build. And she signed it in the strong, clear handwriting of a woman who had stopped being careful and started being true. She was not invisible. She was not temporary. She was not grateful for scraps. She was home, entirely and at last. And she had built it herself, with her own stubborn hands, from nothing but ash and honesty and the refusal, absolute and final, to be anything less than the full, unmanaged, undiminished truth of who she had always been.